Eleanor Hayes had been setting that tree since the year the lights had stopped coming on for him. Every December, her small bungalow on Maple Street smelled of cinnamon and orange peel, and the living room glowed in the soft, forgiving light of the same brittle bulbs Thomas had bought the summer they turned 40. She would drag the faded box from the attic, whisper the same apologies to the ornament that had once broken in a child's tantrum, and hang each glass bauble as if placing a small, trembling truth back into its rightful home. People called it a ritual. Neighbors called it habit. Eleanor called it hope. Her son Michael hadn't stepped across her front threshold on Christmas morning for 12 years. Phone calls became awkward letters. Letters became postcards with vague dates, and dates dissolved into the thin, polite distance that stretched between them, now an invisible fence she kept telling herself had once been built for safety. She had learned to dress her loneliness with tinsel. This year, the air in the house felt thicker, like the moment before a storm, but quieter. Eleanor found herself humming an old hymn with the tree half decorated and the radio dim. She noticed a rustle in the corner of the box. Not an ornament, not a string of lights, but an envelope she had not placed there. The handwriting was familiar in a way that made her chest tighten. Michael's handwriting, altered as if time had learned to disguise him. Inside the envelope was a letter folded twice. The ink bled along the edges by a trembling hand. She sat down on the step that led from the living room to the kitchen and read. The letter did not contain apologies in the way she had imagined, no long speeches of regret, no promises of return. It contained something smaller and sharper. The kind of truth that can settle in your throat and refuse to be swallowed. A declaration of a debt. An admission of fear. A name she had never heard before. It spoke of a choice Michael had made 12 years ago on a night when the house was already asleep and the stars had looked the other way. Eleanor read the line that made the room tilt, felt the air go thin, and understood that the tree, this same tree she had been trimming for decades, had become a witness. Not to Christmases past, but to the reason for his absence. The discovery would pull the thread of everything she had believed about love, loyalty, and the quiet bargains people make to survive. Outside, Maple Street kept its small, indifferent breath. Inside, the lights blinked on the tree, steady, honest, and for the first time in a long while, Eleanor realized the story she had been telling herself about their family might need to be rewritten. Eleanor Hayes's life had, for most of it, been a collage of small certainties. She had learned to measure the world by the way her keys hung on the hook by the door, by the exact rhythm of the kettle's whistle, and by the calendar on the fridge, each holiday circled with the same blue ink. Thomas used to tease her for it. "You mark time like a seamstress counts stitches," he would say, kissing the top of her head while she tied the ribbon on the grocery list. The seam of their life had been ordinary and precise until the late autumn when Thomas fell ill. The house never quite relearned his laugh, but it did remember the things he touched: the indent on the armchair, the spot on the porch steps where he always paused to look at the sky, the hidden drawer where he kept a spare key and a rolled-up photograph of Michael at 6, teeth missing, grinning in the snow. After Thomas, Eleanor kept everything the same. It felt like an act of reverence and rebellion, one to the men she had loved, and the other to the idea that the world could simply continue if she let it. She swore to herself she would not surrender the rituals that had knitted them together. Christmas, above all, became a fortress. Michael had been the loud, starved center of their small family. As a child, he announced himself with scraped knees and boundless questions. As a teenager, he announced himself with slammed doors and passionate letters against the grain of a small town. When he left for college, the house seemed to lean in to listen. The first few years he called often, came home, brought friends for dinner. But something changed in his 20s. There were fewer calls, fewer returns. Eleanor told herself he was making his way, building a life with the kind of recklessness she'd secretly admired. She mailed cookies. She left messages. She put his favorite mug, chipped at the rim, on the top shelf where he used to reach for it. On the 12th Christmas without Michael, the tree box in the attic was heavier than she remembered. She wiped dust from its lid and sighed, thinking of Thomas's hands, calloused, patient, untangling the same string of lights so many times they fit together like an old married habit. Eleanor carried the box down the narrow attic ladder, her niece complaining, her breath making small white clouds in the winter air. She set the box on the living room floor and sat on the rug, letting the quiet press against her. She ran her fingers along a strand of garland, and memory came like a film that had not yet found its break. There were Christmases when the house was full, Michael with a red scarf too big for him, Thomas with a paper crown that kept falling into his lap, Eleanor laughing until her sides ached while she tried to dance with two left feet. There were other years when bills were tighter than tinsel, when she and Thomas made jokes to hide the small panic in their eyes. Those memories were bright and jagged all at once. They kept her from unraveling. This year, for reasons that were as practical as they were sentimental, Eleanor had put up the tree earlier than usual. The neighborhood seemed to be getting younger people with smart lights that changed color at the push of a button, wreaths that looked like magazine spreads, houses turned into glowing postcards of curated joy. Eleanor, stubborn, set her tree on the third Saturday of November, because routine was sometimes the only reliable thing left. She worked slowly. The tree was artificial. They had purchased it in a sale the year Michael left, so you don't have to sweep needles, Thomas had said, half mocking and half considerate. Eleanor preferred real trees. The sharp resin smell of pine felt honest, but the artificial had its own peculiar magic. It kept its shape. It remembered itself. When she stretched the branches open, the tree filled into a generous conifer again, as if taking a breath. The ornaments came out in stages. The glass balls jingled like tiny bells, the apple-red ones bright against the green. A wooden train found its place near the lower branches Thomas had carved it the winter Michael left. A clumsy, loving gift. A paper star with the edges browned by time perched at the top, tilted slightly because whoever had last put it had been wavering in their resolve. Eleanor paused over a small, silver ornament, an angel with hair the color of tarnished moonlight. It had belonged to a woman named Marta, a friend from the church, who passed years ago. Eleanor had always felt the ornament looked out of place among the other baubles, but every year she hung it in memory and thought of Marta's laugh. She found herself speaking to the ornament under her breath. Thomas would like this. Michael would have rolled his eyes. She hummed as she worked, the old hymns that Thomas liked filtering through the house, and when the lights finally blinked on the tree, the room seemed to inhale. Eleanor sat on the couch, hands folded, and let the memory of Thomas fill the spaces. She allowed herself to imagine Michael stepping in his coat dusted with travel, cheeks flushed from some distant wind, and asking, with that old arrogance softened into affection, "Did you leave a cookie for me?" And then there was the envelope. It fell out from the depth of the box when she shook the last strand of tinsel loose, like a thing dislodged from some sleep. It was plain cream, and folded twice. Eleanor almost said it as a thinking it must be old bills or perhaps a church notice. She had found many small, forgotten things in that box before. But when she turned it over, the handwriting on the outside arrested her. It was Michael's. She knew the slope of his letters, the way he crossed his T's like a father who had once tried to teach him to square his life. Eleanor's heart knocked in a rhythm that felt like it belonged to someone younger. Inside, the letter smelled faintly of smoke and coffee, as if written months ago in rooms that were not warm. She smoothed the paper and read the first line. It was not a "come home" or a "forgive me." It was something that made her throat snag. "There are things I could not say because they would have broken you." She read on with slow, careful fingers. Michael's voice on the page trembled between confession and defense. He spoke of a night 12 years before when he had overheard words in the kitchen that he had not been meant to hear. He spoke of a debt, financial, emotional one, that had grown a shadow and hardened into choice. He spoke of fear that his presence would destroy what he loved more than anything. He had left, he wrote, not to abandon them but to keep them from being harmed by the fallout of his decisions. The letter described a person named Clary, a name that did not belong to any photograph on Eleanor's mantel, and a sequence of small catastrophes that had swallowed the boy she knew. The more Eleanor read, the more the room tilted until the ornaments seemed like witnesses arranged around a crime scene. In the letter, Michael's anger turned into apology and then into pleading. In the margins, his handwriting darkened where he had pressed too hard, as if the page had been a punching bag for his guilt. The final line made her hands go cold. I left because staying would have made you complicit in a lie, and I could not bear to have my mother wear that. Eleanor sat very still, the house creaking as an old thing does when it remembers storms. The story she had told herself for years, that Michael had left to find himself, that distance had been an accident of life, began to unspool. In its place grew a landscape of secrecy and sacrificial choices she had not known were being made on her behalf. She walked to the kitchen and opened the drawer where she kept the spices. Her hands hovered over jars of cumin and cloves, and she began to think in lists. Who could know? Which neighbor had seen the nights when the car stayed in the driveway? Would Thomas have known? Her mind, so used to tidy rhythms, started to tumble, placing each thought like a card on a shaky table. Then the phone rang. She had not expected that. It was a number she did not recognize, the kind that could be a wrong number or a solicitor or a neighbor. She answered with the same careful politeness she had extended to the box of ornaments that morning. "Hello, Mrs. Hayes?" said a man's voice, hesitant, gentle. "This is Daniel Carter. I'm well. I'm calling from Std. Bartholomew's. I wondered if you had a minute to talk." Eleanor recognized the name Daniel Carter, the new pastor, who had taken over 2 years ago and had been a fine, attentive presence. She thought of the note in her hand and the way the paper had seemed suddenly sharp. "Yes," she said. "I have a minute." "Mrs. Hayes," Daniel said carefully, "I know this may be unusual, but your son Michael left something with the church some time ago. He asked me if anything ever happened to him. He left something." Eleanor's voice went small. "He asked me to keep it until it was safe to give to you. He called it a letter. He asked me to hold it until the right time. He also," the pastor hesitated, "he left me instructions on how you should be told. He wanted to make sure it reached you in a way that was gentle." Eleanor felt the floor drop in a way that was not physical. The letter in her hands, the envelope, had not been a mistake after all. It had been a thing meant for her, place where she might still find it, even if he never returned to say the words in person. "How long?" she asked, though she already knew. "About 12 years," Daniel said softly. "He asked me to wait until he felt you were ready." Eleanor's life, measured in small certainties and predictable rituals, dissolved into something else, a negotiation of truth. The tree in the corner seemed to breathe with a new weight. Outside, the wind pushed at the eaves. Inside, the bulbs blinked on and off, patient as witnesses. She thought of Thomas in his armchair, and for the first time since the funeral, she spoke aloud to the empty house. "What did you know?" The question was not only for Thomas. It was for herself, for the boy who had left, and for the son she had been trying to raise into an honesty she now realized had never been asked for. The envelope in her lap trembled. Eleanor smoothed it again, and felt, under the faded crease, that the next step was both inevitable and terrifying. She would have to go back through memory like a person walking through a house of mirrors, searching for the reflection that matched a truth. And she would have to face the possibility that loving someone had sometimes meant being kept in the dark. For the first time in years, she really considered the idea of leaving a note for Michael in return. Not to coax him home, not to explain away the missing years, but to tell him she had read, and she had not yet made a decision. She would not be the kind of woman who let a letter be a verdict without asking questions. She folded the letter back into its envelope with a careful hand. Then she wrapped it in a kitchen towel and placed it gently back into the ornament box, between the wooden train and the tarnished angel. The tree's lights blinked, and Eleanor sat alone in the glow, making a promise to herself to follow the thread, to learn the whole shape of what had been kept, and if possible, to find her son before the next Christmas came around. If part 1 was the rupture, Eleanor's discovery that the story she had told herself about the past was incomplete, then part 2 is a careful excavation. Eleanor's days begin to reorient around questions with no easy answers. She visits the places Michael might have been, speaks to people who might hold slivers of truth, and discovers that a name, Claire, reverberates in spaces she had never imagined. The first person Eleanor goes to see is Rosa Jimenez, her next-door neighbor and friend for nearly 20 years. Rosa had watched Michael grow from a freckled boy into a man who avoided small talk the way a deer avoids open space. She also had the kind of memory that kept details like loose change. Rosa invited Eleanor in and poured coffee into 2 chip mugs. Her apartment smelled of simmering garlic and sugar cookies, and there were paper snowflakes taped to the window, a child's craft left by Rosa's granddaughter. "You look pale, Eli," Rosa said. "You found what you weren't supposed to." Eleanor showed her nothing at first. She had learned that revealing a secret without context often made it worse. But Rosa's eyes softened when she saw the envelope on the small kitchen table. "Claire?" Rosa read aloud, tasting the name like someone reading a label in a foreign language. "Do you mean Claire from the gallery? Claire Morgan? She moved here years ago, an artist. Quiet. Her studio used to be on Hawthorne." Eleanor did not know that a gallery existed that had once hosted Claire. In her world, art galleries were polite events with white walls and even politeness. But she found herself making a plan regardless, a plan that included the small thrill of having a new place to go, a new person to ask. At the Hazeltine Gallery, framed prints hung like frozen conversations. The woman at the front desk was young, with a pixie cut, who checked her watch before she checked Eleanor's story. Claire's name brought a thin smile. "She was here years ago," the woman said. "She left for Chicago. People said she had a scandal with a collector. Bit of a mess." Eleanor wrote the name in her notebook and underlined it twice. Back at home, she phrased the letter in new ways. She read the passages again, this time ignoring the lines that accused and circling the places that asked for mercy. Michael's handwriting looked smaller on the second read through, as if the man who had written it had shrunk to fit inside the narrow space of his own shame. There were references in the letter to a certain night, to a meeting at the old Waverly Diner, an all-night place with chipped stools and coffee the consistency of coal tar. Eleanor had never been inside the Waverly, but she had driven past it, watched its neon sign wink like a shy star. The letter said Michael tried to explain the night in a way that would not implicate them, but the sentences broke off as if someone had come to the window and rattled the glass. Eleanor found herself standing by the Waverly one rain-slashed morning, watching the steam rise from the kitchen and listening to the old men inside argue about the weather like they were rehearsing for a play. She ordered black coffee and a slice of pie and saw, in a corner booth, an envelope like the one she had found. Her heart pounded as if she were the one breaking in. She struck up a quiet conversation with a woman sweeping the floor, Margot, who recognized Michael's name. "He used to come through back in the day," Margot said. "Quiet at first. Then he started bringing a girl, Claire, I think." She had a laugh like a match being struck. Trouble was, she liked to argue with rich men. "Rich men?" Eleanor asked, feeling a small, hot pebble of envy and fear. "Collectors and dealers," Margot said. "There was a big fight once, something about an unpaid piece, the kind of business that eats people." Claire left town after a few months of drama. Eleanor left the Waverly with a list of names and a hollow feeling in her mouth. She had the sense that the story was bigger than the envelope, that its edges reached far beyond their tidy kitchen. She began to plot like someone tracing a map with their finger. Claire in Hawthorne, a gallery scandal, a collector with too many promises and too few ethics. She thought of Thomas and how he would have met this news with a quiet, fierce anger. He would have liked to fix it himself, to straighten the world. At the same time, Eleanor became aware of the ways she had been absent in the spaces where Michael lived his adult life. She had been present in the small-town rituals, the PDA meetings, the chilly suppers, but not in the choices and the private disasters that happen in city apartments or late-night meetings. She had kept him close enough to love, but not close enough to prevent him from imagining his departure as the only cure. The days became investigations stitched together with memories. Eleanor went through old photographs, searching for clues. She had missed the laughing woman at the edge of a picnic photo, the background of a graduation image with a woman standing too close to Michael, the way Thomas had paused near the mantel once when Michael had hung a small paper crane and said, "You two will always find each other, won't you?" The crane, Eleanor realized, had been slightly bent the year Michael left. At church, Pastor Daniel sat with her after the service and listened without offering platitudes. He had the kind of calm that made other people confess things they hadn't intended to voice. "People make choices," Daniel said at one point, "and those choices have consequences we can't always foresee. Your son he was protecting. That is not a small thing. How do you protect someone by walking away? Eleanor asked, her voice hard with newly kindled suspicion. Sometimes protecting is containment, Daniel said. Sometimes people think distance will keep the hearth from catching. Sometimes they're right, and sometimes they're wrong. Eleanor wanted to ask if he would have told Thomas. She wanted to ask if Daniel had ever withheld truth in the name of kindness. But she stopped herself. She was beginning to understand that truth was a shape you sometimes had to hold up to the light to see all the sides. One morning, a postcard came from Michael, a single-line note with a city postmark she could not read. It said, "I am safe. You are not to try to find me. Trust me to make the right choice." No explanation. No address. Eleanor read it on the porch and felt the balloon of hope that had floated inside her chest lose air. She folded the card into her palm and felt the print of the ink like a bruise. She tried calling the number scrawled at the bottom of the letter. There had been a phone number, but an automated voice said it was disconnected. She wrote Claire's name, Michael's name, the word debt, the Waverly and the gallery in her notebook, and underlined everything. The letters blurred when she cried, but she kept going. She believed, stubbornly, that a map existed and that she could find it by following the clues. Her search brought her to a woman named Renee Caldwell, who had been a friend of Thomas's in a way that grudges sometimes make people friends through shared history and small mercies. Renee had been local to the county courthouse for decades and had a way of keeping track of the things other people let go. At Renee's kitchen table, over coffee stained with too much sugar, Eleanor laid out the bare facts she had. A letter from Michael, a name Claire, and a gut feeling that something important was hidden in the small print. Renee's eyes narrowed, not with skepticism but with the kind of focus that meant she was thinking of the practicalities: court filings, liens, legalese. "You want me to look through property records?" Renee asked, fingers tapping the table. "If there was a debt, people file things. They leave trails." Eleanor felt a relief like a tide. "Yes," she said. "Find me traces." Renee worked like someone assembling a puzzle. She found mentions of a disputed invoice at the Hazeltine Gallery years ago. There were names attached to a company that had loaned money to an artist on loan of a work. There were signatures, dates, and then a gap. Most of the trail ended in a small corporation with a different name, a common tactic for collectors trying to hide culpability. The map became more complicated, but also more real. It was in one of Renee's searches, an old, yellowed affidavit, typed and signed, that the pieces clicked into a shape that gave Eleanor the small, dizzying taste of revelation. The affidavit mentioned a night when a shipment of artwork had gone missing in transit. One name reoccurred in the margins, a certain Thomas Hayes. Eleanor's Thomas. Eleanor read the paper 3 times until the letters blurred. Her mind lost its edge. Thomas? Involved? Her first reaction was disbelief, then a fast, hot suspicion. Perhaps he had been named because of a clerical error, the kind that put the wrong name next to a signature. She stood and walked to the window, watching the neighbors pass with their little dogs and bright holiday scarves. The world had not changed color. It had only rotated on a new axis. She called Renee back, and the detective work deepened. Renee found an old invoice signed by Thomas, or a man with his name, something so small it could be dismissed, and so precise it could not. She found a notation that Thomas had once lent a garage as temporary storage for a gallery shipment. Eleanor's chest felt as if someone had taken a thin blade and drawn it across the soft skin there. The idea that Thomas could have been connected, helping, perhaps, in ignorance, tore at the confident narrative Eleanor had been telling herself, that Thomas had been a man of straight lines and clean hands. She began to remember things differently. She thought of the winter when Thomas had taken a late phone call and returned to bed once, his face unreadable. She thought of the garage key he kept on a string, and how once he had gone out at night and returned with a bag that smelled faintly of turpentine. Memory, she realized, was a room with doors that opened one after another. Each led to another corridor. Eleanor felt both frightened and oddly buoyed. If Thomas had been involved in some small way, perhaps there were reasons that were not betrayal but mischance. Or perhaps there were things both Thomas and Michael had tried to protect by silence. That night she slept badly, dreams populating with shadowy figures and the echo of Michael's handwriting. The tree in the living room stood like an old sentinel, its lights making small constellations. In the morning, she found a scrap of newspaper under the coffee table. Someone had delivered a leaflet about a community legal clinic, and in the margins, in tiny, careful script, was a phone number and 3 words: "Ask for Claire." Eleanor held the scrap until the paper softened in her fingers. The trace was thin and almost accidental, but she had learned that the most important things are often left where only the desperate will look. On a wet Tuesday, she drove to the address written on the paper, an uptown address between a laundromat and a used bookstore. The doorbell chimed like a tiny, nervous bell in a church. A young man answered with ink on his hands. He apologized, said Claire had left months ago but had once given him a stack of flyers to hand out. He knew little beyond that. Claire had been beautiful, brilliant, and stubborn, and had chosen the wrong man to trust. "You want me to give you her number?" the man asked. Eleanor almost laughed. She had no number. She had only letters, names, and a growing conviction that understanding required a conversation with the people at the center of the truth. As Eleanor left, a gust of wind sent a flurry of dead leaves across the sidewalk, and she felt, absurdly, as if she were walking through the pages of a book she had opened late. The search that had begun with an envelope at the bottom of a box had become a mission: find Claire, learn what Michael had tried to hide, and trace the shape of a young man's choice that had been made in the dark. She had no illusions about what she might find: pain, maybe anger, maybe complicity, maybe relief. But she knew this: the tree in the living room would stand this year not as a ritual of comfortable repetition, but as an altar to a truth she was determined to understand. She would not become small. She would not let the absent son in her life remain a ghost. If the last Christmas tree was to stand witness, it would do so to the whole story. Eleanor put the tarnished heart ornament into a small velvet pouch and tucked it into her coat. The city that had always felt like a distant, humming presence instead pressed close now. Its noises were different from Maple Street's polite breaths, sirens, and late buses, and the soft, repetitive thud of a distant train. She kept thinking about the photograph Claire had given her: 2 young faces lit by the kind of hope that looks reckless in the daylight. She had expected Claire to be defensive or brittle, some bohemian ghost who'd been chewed up and spat out by the art world. When she first opened the studio door and saw the woman inside, what she found was neither myth nor mirror. A person with paint under her nails and an economy of gesture that hinted at someone who had learned to measure emotion in small doses. Claire moved around the room like she owned the light. Thick canvases leaned against the walls, wrapped faces in layers of color and texture. A half-finished sculpture stood like a question mark on a low table. The smell of oil and dust and coffee sat in the air like a stubborn memory. Claire's hair was caught up in a loose knot. A long smear of blue paint crossed the knuckle of her index finger. When Eleanor said her name, Claire did not immediately believe her. The pause was a tiny mercy. It allowed Claire to decide whether she would let the stranger who carried her son's name into this place. "You're Michael's mother," Claire said finally, the words balanced between curiosity and caution. "Yes," Eleanor answered. "I have a letter. He told me your name." She sat as if the chair might dissolve under her, as if the weight of a dozen Christmases had taught her to be careful. Claire listened to the envelope's story without interrupting. When Eleanor told of the envelope found at the bottom of an ornament box, Claire sighed, a sound like breath being released after a hold. "That letter," she said, "he meant for you to have it. But he was afraid what you might do with the knowledge. He thought, if you knew, you'd be safer to think he'd left for ordinary reasons. He didn't want to drag you into what he'd done." Eleanor felt something sharp and hot unfurl in her chest. "What did he do, Claire? Tell me what happened." Claire's eyes darkened, and for a long moment she stared at the paint-splattered floor. When she spoke, the voice was quiet but steady. "We were both younger, and we were both desperate. Vincent Cole was a presents collector, investor, the kind of man who smiles and then rewrites your life. He promised exposure in exchange for work up front and loans for materials. I took the first one, because I didn't know how else to keep making the things that mattered to me. I got in over my head. The payments came due." She told the story without grand gestures, like reading from a ledger where each entry was a small wound. "Vincent had a shipment coming through one winter. He was supposed to ensure it. The gallery was chaotic, people working double shifts, fumes and soda cans, and the kind of exhaustion that blurs into carelessness. Michael and I thought we could move one piece, sell it, pay Vincent. It would be a temporary misdirection. She laughed softly, a sound without amusement. We were idiots. Eleanor listened as if the words were thin glass and might shatter if she looked too hard. Claire described the night in detail, the shipment that never arrived where it should, the phone calls that started in a whisper and became shouts, and Vincent's assistant, an ill-fated man named Harold, whose role in the night became a hinge. Nobody planned for Harold, Claire said. Nobody planned for the way things fell apart. The note says someone got hurt, Eleanor said. Was it Harold? The letter had been guarded in its language, a choreography of avoidance and clarity. Michael's handwriting had been an attempt to control pain with grammar. It was Harold, Claire said, and after that, the weight of it became more than we could carry. Vincent wanted someone to blame publicly, or at least someone he could hold in a court of public opinion. He liked collateral, fragile men and reputations to burn. Thomas, your Thomas, he came that night because Michael called him. He begged your husband to help. Thomas, being Thomas, didn't think twice. He thought he could protect the two of them with one gesture. Eleanor's lungs felt small. She had to breathe in deliberately. Thomas knew, she murmured. He knew what happened. He knew, Claire confirmed. He took some of the heat. He told Vincent he would handle it. He promised to move things, to check the inventory, to be the responsible one who would stitch the tear before anyone saw it. Vincent, always hungry, accepted a temporary arrangement. The paperwork was handled in ways that make sense only in the margins, payoffs, connections, a promise that certain problems could be made to vanish. Why didn't he tell me? Eleanor asked. It was less accusation than bewilderment. Thomas had been a man who kept his sorrows like wood for a winter, burning steadily without show. She had thought she knew him. Because he was protecting you, Claire said simply. Because he thought if you knew the truth, you'd have to carry it too. He thought keeping you from the knowledge would keep you innocent and safe. He was trying to fix a problem in the only way he knew how, by being responsible. That's what I think. Maybe he hoped we could all pretend nothing happened. Eleanor tried to picture Thomas in the gallery, hands that had fixed jammed hinges now used to open drawers and move crates. A face that had always preferred ordinary constancy in the middle of something extraordinary. She had always believed the stories she had made about him, that he would go out in a storm to check on a neighbor, that he would barter for someone's peace of mind. She had not imagined him standing in a gallery's dim light, arranging a story. How did Michael end up leaving? She asked. Claire rested her elbow on the table and touched a scar on her knuckle, a pale line. Michael thought leaving would break the circle. He thought stepping out of the picture would keep you from being implicated, from being hurt. He thought the punishment he might bring upon the family, the shame, would be worse than his absence. He made that decision on a night when we were both raw with fear. Eleanor felt a memory rise. Michael at 19, anger and idealism braided together. She thought of the boy who had once carved a boat from scrap wood and insisted it would float. She thought of the man who had left an envelope in an ornament box, who had chosen silence as a shield. Claire's voice softened. He called me from time to time. In the beginning, he would say, I did this to protect you, and between the words there would be a terror I could taste. He couldn't stay. He had to run. Thomas helped him leave quietly. He told Michael to go somewhere he could think and to wait for the dust to settle. Michael did what he was told. Eleanor closed her eyes and saw the sequence of events like a stop-motion film. An argument, a decision, a door closing. She had been living in the aftermath like someone watching an old photograph fade. The photograph had been misframed. Does Vincent still have influence? She asked. A part of the woman in her, practical, protective, was already calculating possibility and danger. Vincent's gone quieter, Claire said, a bitterness rising at the edges. He still exists. Men like him don't vanish overnight, but the scandal forced him to step back in the way the world sometimes makes room for a new predator. He still has collectors and still makes promises. We're both older now. We've scraped ourselves raw and kept going. Eleanor looked around at the studio. It was a room that bore the marks of repair, of someone who had rebuilt a life with spontaneous, clumsy tools. Her own house had been a gallery of memory, But Claire's place had been made from the shards of a life remade. She realized, with a small, dolorous clarity, that she had been allowed to mourn while others had been punished by the absence of forgiveness. "Why are you telling me this now?" Eleanor asked. "Why tell me that night finally?" Claire's answer was a small, plain thing. "Because Michael asked me to. He gave me a box of memories and told me to protect what I could. He wrote things down and asked the church, and Pastor Daniel, he's been the keeper of what Michael could not say aloud. Michael wanted you to know the truth, but gently. He asked me to be the voice you could hear without being crushed by it. And if I'm not gentle," Eleanor said, half to herself, "then you will be human," Claire replied, with a quick, tired smile. "And he will have to reckon with that." They talked until the late hours. Claire told stories about Vincent's arrogance and the way he used glamour as a weapon. She talked about art that had been traded like currency, friendships strained and repaired, and the small acts of kindness that had saved them, someone sending food, a gallery owner slipping money in Claire's coat pocket, a neighbor loaning a ladder for a mural. Claire had been part of a world where beauty and exploitation lived cheek to cheek, where salvation sometimes came in the form of a borrowed van. By the end of the conversation, Eleanor felt as if she had been in a room with a window that opened onto a new landscape. The contours of betrayal were there, but so were the small human acts that tried to fix it. She left the studio with a stack of photocopies. Claire insisted she keep documents, torn receipts, a picture of Harold with an apologetic smile and a sense that the world had been more complicated than the version she had told herself. Outside, snow had started again, fat and friendly. It blanketed the city in a way that made the grime soften and the lights glow like promises. Eleanor drove home slowly, the velvet pouch warming against her heart. That night she took the heart ornament from its pouch and set it carefully on the tree. She placed it near the wooden train Thomas had carved and the little angel that had belonged to Marta. She turned the light on and watched the bulbs catch on glass and paint and varnish. The tree no longer felt like a piece of ritual. It felt like a ledger, an account of what had been done and what had been forgiven. She'd come looking for answers and found that answers were less often a door slammed open and more often a series of hinges needing oil. Claire's story had given her a shape to the truth, but not the end of it. There would need to be reconciliation or confrontation, probation or absolution. The road back to Michael would require more than longing. It would require honesty. As she sat with the warm light on her face and the ornament resting in her hands, Eleanor realized the real work was only beginning. The letter, the photograph, Claire's testimony, they were not endings but invitations. They invited her to step out of the safety of ritual and into the hard, untidy business of choosing again, whether to forgive, whether to demand full reckoning, whether to let the last Christmas tree witness the whole truth. She placed a hand on the heart ornament and whispered, as if speaking to someone beyond the room, "I will find him." The snow continued to fall, patient as time, while inside the house the tree's lights blinked like small, steady vows. After Claire's studio, Eleanor's days settled into a new, peculiar rhythm. She woke early as if waiting for a train that had been delayed and might appear without warning. She cleaned, made lists on the back of envelopes, and wrote letters she didn't always send. Pastor Daniel met with her twice, an organized man who had an uncanny talent for translating hard things into simple acts. He offered to be a bridge, to hold messages if Michael chose not to return in person, to mediate if needed. Eleanor accepted his help, because after Thomas she had learned that some bridges needed steady hands. One cold morning, a postcard arrived with a smudged postmark. "I am safe. Don't search for me." The sentence was short and blunt, the kind of thing written by someone who had spent years practicing containment. Eleanor read it twice, felt anger rise, a hot, metallic thing, and then a sorrow that was almost tidal. She called Claire and asked for help without explaining entirely why. Claire met her at a small cafe with a pot of tea and an exhausted compassion that made Eleanor feel less alone. "He's scared," Claire said simply. "He's been living on smaller terms so he can make different choices. He thinks staying away keeps you safe." "But he's here," Eleanor insisted. "He left a letter. He left an ornament. He's not a ghost." She felt like a child bargaining. "He's my son." Her voice broke on the last two words. "We know," Claire said. "And if he listens, He'll come. He's always had a streak of stubborn nobility. He thinks he must atone in a way that makes him disappear. We need to make him understand that atonement can happen with presents." "How?" Eleanor asked. She had never been comfortable demanding things from people. She preferred small signposts, cookies, notes. But now, the woman who had spent years measuring life by routine felt something else, an urgency that could not be folded and tucked away. Claire reached across the table and put her hand over Eleanor's. "You call him when you want," she said. "You leave the door open. You keep the tree lit. He'll come when he decides the risk is worth the reward. But he must know that when he returns, he will not be alone in facing what happened." Eleanor nodded and went home to light the tree yet again. She arranged the ornaments with care, placing Claire's silver angel near the heart ornament and the wooden train nearby as if to stitch generations together. The tree had become a map and a challenge. How to hold on to the beauty of family and also demand truth. Days folded into each other. Eleanor found small ways to reach him. A folded note in the church box Pastor Daniel kept, a pie left at the gallery's back stoop with Claire's help, an anonymous postcard that said only, "We are not angry. We want the truth." Each act felt like a pebble in a pond, an attempt to make ripples that might reach the man at its edge. On a thin, silvered evening, as Christmas approached like a long exhale, Eleanor returned from the grocery to find an envelope wedged in the crack of her door. Her fingers trembled as she slipped it open. Michael's handwriting filled the page, the letters uneven and earnest. "Mom," it read, "I read your letters. I don't deserve to come back. I don't know if I can make anything right. But I miss you. I will come Christmas Eve, if you want me there. If you do, leave the front light on. If you don't, burn this and forgive me anyway." The simplicity of it made Eleanor laugh and cry at the same time. She carried the note to the tree and placed it on a low branch, folding it into the bulbs as if tucking a secret into the heart of the house. She turned the light on and left a lamp burning in the window. Christmas Eve was a study in small rituals. Eleanor boiled chestnuts the way Thomas had once done. She dressed the table with a tablecloth he had embroidered as if the thread would stitch the past to the present. She made tea and set an extra cup in the kitchen, though part of her wondered whether she would simply be visiting memory. At 9:30, the porch light clicked on. Eleanor had been sitting close to the tree, her hands in her lap, when she heard a car door. She stood slowly, her breath short, and went to the top of the steps. A man stood under the street lamp, his coat dusted with snow. For an odd, suspended second she thought he might be Thomas come back to check on the house. But then he lifted his head and Eleanor saw the eyes that had once filled their small kitchen with adolescent confidence. "Michael," she said, and the word broke the years-long silence like a sudden bell. He hesitated at the bottom of the steps as if afraid his body might be punished for trespassing on their shared past. "Hi, Mom," he said, voice a rough thing that had been polished by experience. He set down a small duffel and reached up as if the act itself were risky. Eleanor crossed the porch and wrapped him in her arms without thinking. He smelled of cold, of the road, of cigarettes. He didn't smoke anymore. The scent was a foreign thing and a homecoming all at once. They remained like that for a long time, mother and son pressed together, the night surrounding them like an attentive audience. Inside, the house felt like a living thing. Michael's hands brushed the ornaments. His fingers lingered on the wooden train. He sat at the edge of the couch and spoke with halting candor, as if practicing each sentence before letting it free. That night, he started, and then stopped. The words were heavy. "I was scared. I thought if I stayed, Vincent would come after all of us. I thought if I left, if I took the blame, or if I simply disappeared, maybe the rest of you would be safe. You were protecting us," Eleanor said softly. Her voice did not hold accusation. It held a kind of stunned tenderness. "You thought the absence would be a shield." "I thought I was keeping you innocent," Michael answered, "but I was only making myself a ghost." They talked until the house hummed with the liveliness of two people finding speech after silence. Michael described his years away, odd jobs, small towns, payphones he used when he wanted to write and not be traceable, the odd letters smuggled through Pastor Daniel. Eleanor listened, cataloging the details, sometimes reaching out to touch his hand like a small benediction. As the night deepened, Michael's confession turned to anger for Vincent, for the choices he had made in panic, and for his father's quiet decision to protect him in ways that had forced him into exile. Eleanor listened, thinking of Thomas's hints of the nights he had come home and smelled the varnish. She imagined him making deals and promises. She imagined the quiet that had existed between father and son, a kind of pact that kept breath steady. When Michael finally paused, the two of them sat in an exhausted, fragile peace. He had come back, not to be absolved but to be understood. He had come home to be held, not hidden. "Will you stay?" Eleanor asked in the hush that followed. Michael looked at the tree and then back at his mother. "For now," he said, "I don't know what tomorrow brings, but I want to be with you. I wanted to fix what we can." Eleanor finished for him, and he nodded. They slept in the same house for the first time in 12 years. The small domestic rituals returned like slow tides: coffee, dishes, the way Michael made a mess of the sugar jar and then laughed about it. The living room felt fuller, not because it had more people but because it had more reckoning. In the days that followed, they began to talk about the practicalities, what it would mean to be present, whether Michael would turn himself in if evidence surfaced, how to handle the possibility of Vincent's reappearance. The work of returning would be both inward and outward. Apologies to deliver, conversations to be had, legal advice to seek maybe. Past wounds were not erased by presence. They were given the chance to be stitched. Eleanor sought out Renee and asked her to pull any documents she could find about Vincent, the gallery, and the affidavits. Renee worked with a kind of grim efficiency that made Eleanor feel safer. She found small things: slips of paper, a ledger entry that mentioned a shipment, a notarized receipt for a payment that could be traced to a shell company. It was not proof of everything, but it was enough to frame a conversation. When Michael and Eleanor met Claire together for the first time since the studio, there was a small, awkward rehearsal of greeting and forgiveness. Claire cried with an unashamed depth and apologized for the part she had played in the secret that had torn them apart. She spoke of Harold with a trembling compassion that made them all low with grief. Harold, it turned out, had been a man whose mistakes were more consequence than malice. They did not chase vengeance. The first thing they chose instead was truth. They spoke openly in the presence of Pastor Daniel, who had offered to host the conversations in his office, a neutral space with clocks that moved predictably. Vincent, they realized, might still have influence, but their first purpose was not to humiliate him. It was to lay their story out plainly so they could choose how to move forward with integrity. Eleanor learned to hold difficult things in her hands without dropping them. She learned that choices: Thomas's, Michael's, Claire's, had reasons, sometimes admirable and sometimes shameful. She learned that forgiveness does not mean forgetting. It means replacing a wound with a new kind of memory. At night, when the house quieted, Eleanor would sit by the tree and watch the bulbs tinge the ornaments with small halos. She would feel Thomas's absence like a warm ache that would not vanish, and beside it, a flicker of gratitude that Michael had come back. The last Christmas tree, which had once been an emblem of routine mourning, had transformed into something else, a witness. It watched not only their grief but also their attempt to do better. They did not yet know the shape of consequences to come. Legal inquiries could be messy. Vincent could retaliate. Public whispers might follow. But for now, in the hush of a small house on Maple Street, they sat and waited and planned and forgave in careful increments. The work of return, Eleanor had learned, is not a single act but a series of small, brave decisions kept day after day. The winter that followed Michael's return was not cinematic in the way Eleanor used to imagine. No dramatic courtroom battles, no sweeping reconciliations in the snow. Instead, it was made of small, durable moments. Late-night talks that lasted until dawn, quiet drives to appointments. The clatter of tools as Michael fixed the porch and the kitchen drawer Thomas had always said was loose but never got around to repairing. They began cataloging what they knew. Renee's research yielded enough to sketch out a timeline. There were invoices and a ledger with a name that seemed to function more as a signpost than evidence, a company with a name that suggested itself as a veneer for something uglier. Renee found a note in a filing cabinet. Someone had once kept careful records of a payout. The paper was old, smudged at the edges, but it had signatures that could be traced. The practical work of confronting the past happened in small committees. Claire met with a lawyer who helped secure copies of documents for a formal review. Pastor Daniel mediated conversations where Michael recounted details. It was not dramatic testimony so much as a human map. What had been attempted, what had failed, what people had intended in moments of panic. Harold's name surfaced again and again, not as a villain but as a human casualty of the night, someone who had been caught in the crossfire of plans that were never properly considered. Vincent Cole, when he was spoken of, seemed to be a middle distance away, someone who had not been fully in their lives for years but who still cast an outsized shadow. Vincent's movements were hard to trace. He had the kind of wealth that allowed documents to bend and memories to misalign. The question they all faced was not only about punishment. It was about truth, accountability, and the possibility of healing. Michael volunteered to tell his story to a truth committee, friends and acquaintances who knew enough to bear witness. He wanted to confess openly, to let the record be what it was. The committee sat in Pastor Daniel's back room with cups of coffee gone cold, and Michael spoke in a voice that grew steadier as he went on. He told them about the plan, about the fear that had lodged in his chest, about the moment he decided to leave. He did not seek pity. He sought to set things right however he could. The process was not clean. There were accusations and confused memories. Some people who had once been allied with Vincent remained loyal to the status quo. But the arc of their small town, its ability to evolve in the face of truth, proved stronger than they expected. People listened. Some apologized where apology was due. Some receded. The truth had a way of clearing space as it moved. At home, Michael began to repair the house himself. He fixed the loose porch step that Thomas had intended to mend. He painted the hallway the color Eleanor had always loved, a pale, hopeful blue. He and Eleanor cooked soup together and argued about whether one should salt the broth early or late. They argued with the affectionate irritation of family, and each argument stitched them closer. On afternoon, Claire called and asked if she could bring someone by. Eleanor agreed, half curious and half nervous. Claire arrived with a woman who introduced herself as Lucy, Harold's sister. She was older than Claire by a decade, with hair the color of pewter and eyes that had learned not to trust lightly. Lucy sat with them at the kitchen table and told stories that filled in blanks a childhood spent with Harold, his clumsy good nature, a stint in which he'd tried to settle into a job and then been swallowed by an incident not entirely of his making. She carried in her hand a folded packet of letters Harold had written to no one in particular. They were small apologies, attempts at explanation. Listening to Lucy, Eleanor felt the story become fuller, less able to be reduced to single lines. Harold was no longer simply a casualty. He was a person with a family and regrets. Claire collected Lucy's stories and offered to help with a small memorial, to speak to people who might have forgotten Harold's humanity in the rush to salvage their own reputations. In the weeks that followed, a small community conversation unfolded, one in which they tried to hold a more honest ledger of fault and kindness. It didn't fix everything. The fractures were real, and certain relationships would never fully mend. But the public record, once vague and dangerous, was beginning to solidify into a narrative that could be faced. Then came a day when an unexpected envelope arrived at the church. Pastor Daniel opened it with a cautious hand. Inside were photographs and a small check, evidence of an arrangement from years earlier. The check had a faded signature that matched a faceless shell company's Renee had found. The evidence was not a smoking gun, but it was enough to force a pause and an inquiry. Legal advice was sought. People who were in positions of power in the local art scene found themselves asked questions. Vincent didn't show up in person. Men like him rarely do. But the ripples reached toward him, presaged in little by little human interest pieces that spoke more about the human cost than the scandal. Vincent's reputation shifted. It no longer felt indestructible. Through it all, the Hayes house remained a constant. The last Christmas tree still lit at night, a small jewel in the window like a steady promise. The tree watched them adjust to new realities. Michael met with people who had been affected by the theft. He apologized to those he could locate. He sat with Harold's sister and listened to what had been lost. He took responsibility in ways that were awkward and earnest. On the anniversary of Thomas's death, they held a small remembrance. The house filled with a handful of people who had been constant: Rosa, Renee, Claire, Pastor Daniel, Lucy, neighbors who had stood by Eleanor in quieter ways. They lit a candle for Thomas and spoke of his steadiness, his mistakes, his virtues. They didn't attempt to absolve him of choices that might have been reckless. They tried to understand the shape of a man who had loved imperfectly. Eleanor spoke, her voice steady and personal. Thomas chose a way to protect his family, she said. We may not understand every decision, but we can acknowledge that he did what he thought best, with the courage he had. We also know that courage can be complicated, and we must be honest with ourselves about the consequences. The room was quiet but full. Michael placed the wooden train on the mantel and in a small, ceremonial gesture, set the tarnished angel beside it. They were not creating a shrine to error. They were arranging relics of a life whose pieces had to be examined. Christmas approached again, but this time it felt different. The tree had become less a symbol of passive ritual and more a signpost of what the family had endured and tried to repair. They invited Claire and Lucy and a few neighbors to dinner. The meal was imperfect, sauce spilled, a pie slightly overdone, but it was alive. Conversations wound from small talk into confession and back again, and the house rang with a fragile kind of merriment, laughter that knew sorrow but refused to be consumed by it. That night, after the guests had gone and the dishes were done, Eleanor sat by the tree and wrote a letter not to anyone in particular, but to record the moment. She wrote of the way forgiveness is a work of attention, how it requires naming and facing things that scare us, and how love continues to ask for more than comfort. Michael came and sat beside her. He picked up the heart ornament and turned it in his hands. For a long time he did not speak, but finally he said, I used to think protection meant keeping people out of harm by removing myself. Now I think protection sometimes means staying and paying the cost. Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder. And sometimes it means asking forgiveness of the people you love, she said. And sometimes it means forgiving yourself. They watched the tree lights blink slowly, each flash a heartbeat. Outside, snow fell in a hush that felt almost holy. The last Christmas tree illuminated a little room, and through its simple light, the complicated truth of a family being repaired in increments. Years from now, other people might tell the story differently. They might remember the scandal as a footnote or the memory of a town stirred by rumor. But for Eleanor and Michael, for Claire and Harold's family and the small, battered community around them, the better story was the one that had been made by staying, by listening, by acknowledging harm, and by doing the unglamorous work of making reparation. In the ember glow of the tree, Eleanor thought of Thomas and felt, not a simple absolution, but a gratitude for the man who had acted even in flawed ways to keep his family together. She whispered into the quiet, "Thank you," and felt the house lean in, like an old friend returning a greeting. Outside, Maple Street slept under a soft blanket of snow. Inside, beneath the steady light of the tree, they had found something far deeper than the ritual, a shared, imperfect attempt to be whole. The last Christmas tree stood as witness not to an ending, but to a willingness to continue.